Howdy, it's Uncle Paul. So today I'm going to read chapter 4 of my little self-published book from 2003, Bears Don't Eat Fat People. And this is the illustration that my dad drew for this chapter. And this chapter is called The Mobilization. Now, just remember that this is a creative nonfiction book. That's the category. So there's a lot of stuff in here that's very creative, okay? Not everything, but most everything. Okay, here we go. The Bears were more active than they had been in years. Severe drought had depleted food sources in the upper elevations of the mountains, and the bears were encroaching ever closer to town in search of food. Bears were breaking into homes on the outskirts of town in order to raid the refrigerators, sometimes while the owners were still there. It wasn't long before seeing a bear on Main Street became a common occurrence. Old-timers couldn't remember when bears were so desperate, so bold, and in such numbers. Once bears were close to extinction, but government protection had brought them back. They weren't content with simply raiding refrigerators and trash cans. Domestic animals were being killed, and attacks on humans, though rare, had increased. Though nobody was attacked in town, when night fell, citizens were glancing over their shoulder. I had a lot of serious thinking to do. What kind of idiot would stay in the woods for a week, for no reason, while starving bears desperately scoured the land for a morsel of food? Add to the equation a several hundred-pound morsel, and then the idiocy would be complete. I was sure I would satisfy a small family of bears for several days, and feared this would be my destiny if I followed through with my plan. However, I did have a plan. I was well prepared for this adventure. Knowing how to avoid bears was a major part of my learning, and if those tactics didn't work, I had a big rifle. Yes, the whole point was to see a bear, but there was no reason to roll out a red carpet for one. The day finally arrived, and I was up early gathering my gear. I double and triple checked my list. After the rifle and toilet paper, the most important thing was food. For 2 months I had managed to cut down on my portions of food, but there was still no way I could pack in the amount of food I normally ate, nor could I take the food that I loved. I was strictly limited to non-perishable, non-palatable, add water to food. In reality, food wasn't all that necessary. There was at least one advantage to being fat. Starvation would be a very long process. If I were ever stranded with a group of people without food and little hope for swift rescue, I would be the last to worry about becoming a survival banquet. If I were ever to go on a hunger strike to bring attention to some political cause or injustice, well, that would never happen anyway. I was surprised at how much could fit in the backpack, but wasn't surprised when the backpack didn't fit me. The shoulder straps felt comfortable enough, but a strap was also to go around my waist. Waist? I no longer had one. The day I lost my waist was the day I had to concede that I was fat. On the day you lose your waist, you must start wearing fat pants, and there is no sense denying the awful truth any longer. When you begin wearing fat pants, you are assuredly, positively, unquestionably, indisputably fat. What am I talking about, you ask? What are fat pants, and how can one lose his waist in one day? The day you lose your waist is when you are no longer able to reach far enough under your belly to button your trousers. No matter how much you strain and stretch, your hands are unable to meet. Your only option, other than losing weight, but you know this isn't going to happen, is to buy pants that will button at a point that both your hands can simultaneously reach, which is normally right under your plump pectorals. What a shock! What an eye-opener! What an adjustment! Bending over was difficult enough, but now that your belly is bound in the middle, it is impossible. You had ridiculed and rejected them, but pants with elastic waistbands, pleats, and drawstrings are now your salvation. Bending over was something I would be doing a lot on this trip, but I had gotten used to fat pants many, many years ago. Now my pants are so large they would make a good car cover for a Volkswagen Bug. A rope would have to be used to secure the backpack properly around my so-called waist. The plan was to leave my truck at Robin and Kate's cabin, hike about 2 miles, and set up camp in a particular meadow they had suggested. It was near a little lake, and a horse trail would lead me directly to it through the woods. The sun hadn't been up long by the time I arrived at the cabin, but Robin and Kate were gone, already hard at work somewhere on the ranch. Though the official season of summer was near, the mornings were very cold, and I had 4 layers of clothes adding to my natural bulk. After roping the backpack to myself, I was set to go. By my truck, I stood still for a long moment of contemplation. People go on such little camping trips all the time without hesitation or consternation, but this was a big deal for me. I had placed great importance on the success of this trip without defining what success would be. Not being eaten by a bear would easily be considered a success, but what more was I expecting? I didn't know what to expect, but I was going to find out. Before my first step, I grabbed my rifle and whispered a short prayer, which was the first of many during my excursion. I wasn't used to walking 2 miles at a time, so I paced myself. At first, the trail was flat and pleasant, but that didn't last long. The rapid ascension taxed me quicker than I expected. The higher I climbed, the denser the forest became. Trees and bushes crowded the trail, making it hard to navigate. How shameful. I was nearly too big for a trail traveled by horses. My legs began to ache and my breathing was labored. Why did this backpack have to hold so much? Not having completed a mile, I thought of what items I could do without and considered dumping them by the trail. Thinking I was going to keep a steady pace was foolish. Every 5 minutes I took a minute break. At this rate, it was going to take me a week just to get to the meadow. What if I had a heart attack? Robin and Kate said they would check on me in a couple of days, but who would have thought I might perish only 2 hours into my adventure? Finally, the top of the hill was in view. Between frantic suctions of air, I said, "Please let the lake be there." Thankfully, after topping the hill, the remainder of the trail was level, the woods thinned, and were less overwhelming. By the time I reached the meadow by the lake, my attitude had improved. I made it alive to the campsite, so things were going well. Noon was approaching, and lunch weighed heavily on my mind, so I got to work setting up camp. According to the bear experts, the door of the tent should face a climbable tree to be used as a quick escape route from a bear. Finding a tree that I could climb wasn't going to be easy. Unable to pull myself up, the limbs would have to be low enough for me to step on. Then there would have to be enough space between the limbs for me to crawl through. In other words, any tree that I could climb, a grizzly bear could climb right up after me. Determining that no such tree had ever been created, I pitched my tent on the edge of the meadow about 100 feet from the shore of the lake. It was a 2-man dome tent and a perfect fit. The next chore was to set up the cooking area. Once again, according to the experts, all cooking must be done at least 125 feet from the tent. Though I would engulf the food in my regular speedy fashion, the aroma would linger and possibly attract bears. The shoreline of the lake was only 100 feet away, but it consisted mostly of rocks and dirt. I constructed a ring of rocks by the water's edge, and within it built my cooking fire. For lunch, I had macaroni with cheese sauce and raisins for dessert. After cleaning the cook set, it was necessary to store my food properly. Bears are able to break into almost anything, so the experts suggest hanging your food from the limb of a tree about 100 foot from your tent. I walked along the tree line of the meadow until finding the right tree. One end of the rope was to be tied to the trunk, and the bag containing the food was tied to the other end. Then all you had to do was throw the bag over a limb that was about 20 foot off the ground. The bag must be high enough so a bear couldn't reach it from the ground, and hang low enough from the limb so a bear couldn't get to it by climbing the tree. The question was, could I get to it? 3 attempts, and the bag made it over the limb. Pause here. You can see that I was woefully uneducated on how to hang a food bag. You throw the rope, obviously, not the bag, but I was not doing any kind of backpacking at this point. Okay, all right, back to it. I was exhausted, and it was time for a nap. Since I couldn't fit inside, I laid on top of the sleeping bag and used a blanket for cover. Just as I got comfortable, I remembered another bear expert rule: never sleep in the same clothes you wore while cooking. The tent wasn't tall enough for me to stand, so I tried to change clothes lying down. I'm sure I looked like a beached whale struggling to get back in the sea. That method wasn't working, so my only option was to change outside. Stripping in the outdoors in the middle of the afternoon was an act my conscience heartily resisted, but I was on private land, miles away from any human eyes. Still, I rushed as though I were stripping in front of a stadium full of people. The pants exchange was first and went smoothly. Then I pulled off the dirty shirt and stopped. The sun and the cool breeze felt good against my skin, a sensation I hadn't experienced in years. I hadn't been shirtless outside since I went swimming as a little boy. Since I had the privacy, I wanted to remain that way, but couldn't. It was too strange. I put on the clean shirt, put the dirty clothes in a plastic bag, and placed it by the cook area. By the time I woke up from my nap, it was time for supper. I changed back into my cook clothes, but this time I didn't rush. After supper, I gathered enough firewood to last a couple of days. There wasn't a chair, so I dragged a log to the cook area to sit on as I enjoyed an evening campfire. The day gradually turned into dusk, and several horses made their way to the lake from the trail I had traveled earlier, giving me a wide berth. Satisfying their thirst, they continued along the trail which wrapped around the lake and disappeared into the woods on the other side. Once darkness fell, unexplainable noises came from the woods, but to my surprise, none of them daunted me. Instead, I was intrigued. Reclining on the ground with my head on the log and staring over my belly into the fire, different emotions took their turn with my brain. Contentment, joy, humility, sadness, wonderment, and excitement. Fear, the only emotion I truly expected to sense, didn't make an appearance. I was in the woods at night by myself, but with a rifle, with bears on the rampage, and wasn't afraid. This was just a first step, but maybe I did have it in me to be adventurous. Yes, I was very pleased with myself. Unable to contain my excitement, I howled like a wolf. Ow! And again, ow! And louder once again, ow! That felt great. But the suddenness of my action must have shocked the nearby creatures because the woods became silent. After a moment, the noises returned one by one. A new sound reached the camp, coming from a great distance. A real wolf answered my howl. I sat up and carefully listened. A second howl arrived a moment later. I actually called a wolf. Yes, there was hope for me after all. This was going to be a good week. I settled down again into my reclining position. The atmosphere called for camp songs, and for the next hour I sang every song I knew and some I didn't really know at all. The benefit of my nap was finally dissipating, and weariness set in. I didn't want to move a muscle, but the tent, which contained my bed, was 100 feet away. Maybe I would just sleep by... There was a sudden noise to my left, coming from the trail where the horses had departed earlier. I placed my hand on the rifle beside me. "Hello?" I called as I sat up. It was probably just another horse. Whatever it was just beyond the light of the fire. I called again, "Hello?" But it remained silent. My flashlight was with my mess kit on the other side of the fire, closer to the lake. As gingerly as possible for a fat man, I rose to my feet, carrying the rifle and not taking my eyes from the spot where I heard the noise. I retrieved the light. I aimed the beam of light at the spot, but nothing was there. Slowly I directed the beam further to the left, away from the lake. There it stood about 30 yards away, the glow of its eyes low to the ground. Whew, it was only a dog. No, it was a wolf, and it began to growl. What was I supposed to do? I knew nothing about wolves. Bears were starving, so I should have known wolves would be too. Surely a lone wolf wouldn't attack. Maybe it wasn't alone. Fear had finally joined the party. I backed up to where my boot heels were in the water. At least nothing would attack me from behind. The wolf began to pace back and forth about 10 feet in either direction, growling continually. I really didn't want to shoot it. If the U.S. government reacted toward killing a wolf the way they did toward killing bears, I could get a life sentence. With every pace, the wolf inched closer. "Go, wolf!" I hollered without effect. I threw a rock, but it fell nowhere near the target, and the wolf came closer. Aiming the rifle directly above me, I pulled the trigger. The loud crack of sound reverberated through the woods for several seconds, and the wolf stood still. "Go, wolf!" I screamed. Abruptly, the wolf began running directly for me. Raising the rifle to my shoulder and grasping the light with the same hand I used to hold the barrel, I took aim. Boom! Once again, a loud crack of sound was released. The recoil of the rifle caused the beam of light to jump, and I lost the target. By the time I recovered, the wolf was no longer there. Still holding the light to the barrel, I swept the beam back and forth across the meadow. Where did it go? Obviously, I missed it. My arms got tired of holding the rifle, and I set it down. Several minutes elapsed as I continued to search with the light. My boot heel still in the water. There was no sign of the wolf, not even a sound. I couldn't just stand there all night, so I threw more wood on the fire and sat down with my back to the lake. Finally, I got tired of holding the light. For at least an hour I sat and sang until growing weary again. I had to get some sleep. I was so tired, I no longer cared about the wolf or about bears. With the rifle in one hand and the flashlight in the other, I walked the 100 feet to my tent and went to bed. The tent was warm when I woke. The sun was up and it was well into the morning. Next time, if there was one, I would remember to bring a watch. My stomach was starving, but the rest of my body didn't care. However, my bowels were also crying for attention, and my body was motivated. With toilet paper in one hand and a little shovel in the other, I walked several yards into the woods. Decency prevents me from going into detail concerning my business in the woods, but it was a first for me. Since the successful completion of my potty training, never had I gone without a toilet. Words can't describe how arduous a process it was. Of course, using the restroom at my size was never a simple affair. One of the great curiosities normal-sized people have is how do fat people fit on a toilet, and how do they clean themselves properly? In other words, how can we reach you know where? Let me just say we have our ways, but the big fear is using the restroom as a guest in someone's home. How do you present the news to your host that you've broken their toilet seat? Maybe you don't tell them so they might possibly believe that the cat did it while drinking out of the pot. Afterward, with great humiliation, I had to take a bath in the lake. I made a solemn promise after this trip I would never again, as a fat man, defecate in the woods. After dressing in clean clothes, my stomach begged for attention, so I retrieved some oatmeal and a small container of sugar from the feed bag. While building a cook fire, I berated myself for not bringing Robin and Kate's propane stove. Yes, it would have added more weight to the pack, but what a luxury it would be now. The events of the day before pushed me to the limits of exhaustion I hadn't experienced since those dreaded football practices in high school. During my varsity season at age 18, I weighed 275 pounds. But thanks to my coaches, the football program for the games said I weighed 250. I was quick for my size, but a terrible football player. It was during that time I discovered I wasn't a leader. Two players were chosen before every game to be the team captains. As a captain, you led the team in warm-up exercises, you went on the field for the coin toss, and whenever there was a penalty, you had to relay to the referee whether your team was going to accept or reject it. The responsibility was minimal, but still I disliked it. No, I was happy being the best follower I could be. I look back at those years with some amazement. Despite all the insecurities about my weight, I was very active. Football presented me with many challenges. For instance, I didn't want to wear the usual shorts or cut-off shirt, so in the torturous heat of summer training, I wore sweats. On account of my fat body, I was embarrassed to take a shower in the locker room, so I waited until I got home. The strange thing is, I didn't particularly like football. My father and older brothers had played, but never did they pressure me to play or look down on me when I didn't play my junior year. I hated practices, but only mildly enjoyed the games. Once a game was over, it was out of my mind. Many of my teammates at the conclusion of the season could recollect every play from the first scrimmage game. No, I don't know why I played football. There was a great deal of agony involved and very little joy. Maybe it was the camaraderie. Maybe it helped me to feel accepted. Maybe it was for the experience. Whatever the true reason, I still look back on those times with nostalgia. I was also in the choir in high school, which presented challenges as well. With choir, I loved the practices but hated the performances in contests. For choir performances, we had to wear tuxedos, and I never had a jacket that fit comfortably. My mother had to alter the biggest jacket the choir had, enlarging it so it could be buttoned. Thank God for mothers. The only thing I enjoyed as much as singing was acting. During those years, I was very active in the local community theater. Fitting me in costume was always complicated, but once I was on stage, I no longer felt fat. Walking into a small room of strangers was torture for this timid tubby, but being on stage in front of hundreds was liberating. Maybe as a character on stage, I was no longer a fat me, but a fat someone else. Whatever the reason, it was a lot of fun. I even spent a year in college majoring in theater. What happened? Somewhere along the way, I abandoned those things I once enjoyed. As the pounds were added, my interests were dropped. They became too difficult to enjoy. While eating my oatmeal, a dark cloud moved overhead. Drops of rain began to fall, so I kicked some dirt on the fire and went to my tent, taking with me the oats and sugar. Rainstorms usually didn't last long in the mountains. I took the opportunity to read my Bible. I began in the 3rd chapter of the book of Judges. As far as I could determine, this was the only place in the scriptures that a fat person was mentioned by name. Verse 17 says, "Now Eglon was a very fat man." There are no judgments in this passage concerning the weight of Eglon, but he was clearly a wicked man. He was the king of Moab, and after defeating the Israelites, he ruled over them for 18 years. Ehud, an Israelite from the tribe of Benjamin, was sent to deliver his people from the evil rule of Eglon. Under his clothes, Ehud concealed a homemade dagger of approximately 18 inches, which was strapped to his thigh. Believing that Ehud had a tribute for him from the Israelites, Eglon invited him into his personal quarters. The Bible tells it this way: "Then Ehud said, 'I have a message from God for you.' So he arose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the dagger from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. Even the hilt went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the dagger out of his belly, as his entrails came out." Eglon was truly a fat man, but probably no fatter than me. I was fairly confident that my belly could accommodate 18 inches of blade and hilt with room to spare. That's a big belly. A few years ago, I discovered just how big my belly really was. I was sharing an apartment with my best friend, Dustin, and for grins, we decided to conduct an experiment. The results were as follows. My belly was too big for the restroom sink, too small for the kitchen sink, but a perfect fit for the toilet bowl. What proud memories. The rain finally stopped, and I decided to go for a walk. With rifle in hand, I followed the horse trail around the lake and penetrated the woods on the other side. The trail was easy going until about 100 yards, where it began to ascend a hill. I stopped. My body was simply too sore for such a workout. Going around the hill crossed my mind, but that would mean leaving the trail, and that wasn't a good idea. I read about people leaving hiking trails and never being heard from again. However, getting lost for a while might solve my problem. In James Michener's book, Texas, he described how a great Spanish explorer, Cabeza de Vaca, looked after being lost in the woods. He was perfectly flat from rib to loins. Not a fingernail's thickness of fat showed anywhere. That's one way of losing weight, but I think a little too drastic. Boring as it might be, I would have to be content with hanging around the campsite. Also, it would probably be safest. Heading back to camp, I thought of how nice the weather was that afternoon. The sun was hidden behind clouds, which no longer threatened rain, and a cool breeze made nature seem fresh and new. Since the wolf incident, I had been uptight, but the walk, as brief as it was, led me back to flaccidity. The brief hike also brought some fatigue, and I was thankful to reach the clearing at the lake. Something odd caught my eye at the camp on the other side of the lake, and I had to stop to assure myself I was seeing correctly. The tent was shaking. Yes, there was a breeze, but it wasn't strong enough to agitate it so violently. Emerging suddenly from the tent were two little brown creatures rolling like balls. They were bear cubs. Over the snout of one was the box of oats I left in my tent, and the other was trying to steal it. As they wrestled, my nerves distributed goosebumps from head to toe. The back of my neck grew cold and my legs weak. Where was the mama? My education taught me that most bear attacks were by mothers who sensed their babies were in danger. I also learned the worst thing to do was run. Slowly, I backed toward the woods from where I had just come. Once in the trees, I turned and began to jog down the trail, glancing back every few seconds to see if Mama was in pursuit. I didn't stop until I reached the foot of the hill where I retreated just moments before. I was going to have to climb it after all. Securing the rifle to my torso with the sling, I tackled the hill. My eyes and my concentration were on the ground because I couldn't afford a misstep. Lifting my massive legs was agonizing, and I grunted with each step. Between each grunt was a desperate gasp for air. The top of the hill was getting closer, and I made a deal with myself. If I didn't stop until I got to the top, I would then take a rest. My chest burned and my peripheral vision disappeared, turning to darkness. Was I about to faint? Adrenaline was keeping me from total collapse. Only a few more grueling steps and I would be able to rest. Just as I was about to reach the top, a colossal brown creature bounded over the crest of the hill, striking hard, knocking me off the trail into some bushes. Ah! I screamed in terror. I struggled to free myself from the entanglement of limbs and get to my feet. The sling had broken and my rifle fell, but it wouldn't have helped anyway. The animal made a loud noise, prompting me to scream again. Ah! I buried my face in my arms and froze, waiting for the inevitable pain from slashing claws and tearing teeth. A few seconds passed and all I could hear was my breathing. Nothing was happening. Wait, that wasn't the roar of a bear. Peeking over an arm, I saw the creature standing a few feet away looking at me. It was a horse. As I lay there in relief, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The rifle was under my thigh, and it was a wonder I hadn't shot myself. Allowing myself a couple of minutes to catch my breath, I began to maneuver free from the bushes. The horse was startled and continued down the trail. With rifle in hand, I stepped back on the trail. A quick self-examination revealed only a sore shoulder and some minor cuts. I wondered how the horse had fared. My mouth was horribly dry, and without a canteen, I closed my mouth and tried to conjure up some spit. What was I going to do now? Was I safe? Should I wait there a while and then go back to camp? That idea was rejected quickly. But I couldn't stay there. It would be getting dark soon. The horse trail had to lead somewhere, so I continued on it. My pace was much slower, and my eyes were busy scanning the woods in every direction. Every stump and thick bush became a potential bear. As day turned to dusk, the animals began to roam. There were squirrels, rabbits, deer, moose, and all kinds of birds. Too bad I couldn't enjoy them. At the moment, I wasn't very impressed with the beauty of nature. Survival of the fittest was my mindset, and based on my current state of fitness, I felt extremely vulnerable. Bambi would have been considered a threat. Dusk quickly turned into darkness, and I kept my slow but sure pace. The experts say to make noise so that a bear might be scared away, avoiding an encounter. So I began to preach in the darkness to all the creatures that would hear. It was the best sermon I ever preached, and I was certain had animals been amenable to the gospel, the conversions would have been of biblical proportions. The trail was difficult to see, and at times I wasn't sure if I was still on it. Then the trail split. Should I go to the left or the right? Whispering another quick prayer, I took the trail to the right. The temperature began to drop, and although walking helped keep me warm, soon I would have to stop due to exhaustion. Fear of getting eaten alive was rapidly being replaced with the distinct possibility of freezing to death. Not only that, but I had to defecate again. Could this nightmare get any worse? Suddenly the trail started to descend. Though better than walking uphill, it still wasn't easy. I fought to keep my mass from gaining too much momentum, lest I lose control and tumble down. Occasionally my feet would slip from under me. I managed to land on my rear. Once again, it was a wonder I didn't shoot myself with the rifle. When I reached the bottom, I had to rest. Not sitting for fear of getting too comfortable to continue, I stood, stretching from side to side. In the distance, I heard the bray of a horse. My spirits perked up. Maybe ahead there was a lean-to or shelter of some kind. The longer I stood still, the more my bowels applied pressure. Onward I went. Only a few minutes passed before I could see the outline of a structure in the moonlight. The trail was leading directly to it. There was also a corral. As I got closer, things began to look familiar. That was Robin and Kate's barn, which means on the other side is, yes, Robin and Kate's cabin. Only a few yards away was a toilet, and my bowels knew it. The race was on. Pounding on the front door, I hollered, "Robin, Kate, it's Paul." I repeated both until I saw a light come on inside. Seconds later, the porch light shined and the door opened. "What's wrong?" Robin asked with concern. "What happened?" "I'll tell you in a minute. Where's your restroom?" I asked, handing him my rifle as I entered the house. "Down the hall, first door on the right." Kate was standing on the stairs. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I will be in a minute," and I closed the door to the restroom. 20 minutes passed before I emerged from the splendorous room. Robin was sitting at the kitchen table with a big glass of water. "I thought you might be thirsty," he said. "Thank you." I sat and immediately gulped down 2/3 of the liquid. A wall clock caught my attention. It was nearly midnight. "I'm so sorry about this, Robin." "It's okay. What happened?" He again asked. I began with the bear cubs, but eventually turned to the wolf. In the end, I explained all the events of my short adventure, except for the potty incident in the woods. Robin could see I was running down swiftly. "Why don't you stay in the guest room upstairs, and in the morning I'll drive you back to your camp." "In the morning I am going to break camp and go home." Glancing first at the stairs, I looked back at Robin and asked, "Do you mind if I sleep on the couch?" "Of course not. I'll get you a pillow and a blanket." The couch felt wonderful, and I knew my morning wasn't going to begin until at least noon. Throwing the pillow and blanket on the couch beside me, Robin asked, "Have you made any conclusions? Do bears eat fat people?" Deep down, I had always known the answer. It was really so simple. With a frown, I looked at Robin and replied, "Do fat people poop in the woods?" The end of chapter 4.